All right, you guys should be able to hear me. We are doing Linux Automation Unit 7. I'm finally getting around to recording all of these. These were from late last year, and now we're going to go through and talk about the different topics and get the recordings out for people that are involved with it down in the Linux group. So, my name is Scott Champagne, and I am going to be talking through this week. So, if you had anything to message me, make sure you do it down in the Discord. If we had any class meetings, if I was going to be gone, any of that kind of stuff, I'd drop it here. It's just our normal boilerplate announcements. Last week, which was just recorded a few minutes ago, or a few hours ago, we talked about release engineering and what that kind of looks like as a process, and then Aptainer versus Packer for image tooling and how we might build containers, right? We talked yesterday, or the last class, about just building out and getting to a working container of some type, and multiple different tools for doing that. How we look at, external resources are not controlled by us, but once we pull it in, we have this loci of control around this tool. We can do whatever we want with it, right? Then we did a worksheet and we did some labs and stuff, and you guys did the lab with me if you were around. And then those were our course objectives, which was to describe the activities of an automation mindset, which is to automate that build process so that it's something that we don't have to go manually do anymore. And there's a little bit of setup with that, but it can make our lives easier. It can make things more repeatable and quicker and all those kind of things. So it's really where we want to get to be as an engineer, is thinking about how to automate simple tasks, right? And then map out where automation works within CI/CD pipelines. We were at the very beginning of a CI/CD pipeline. We were pulling down a container for the first time and building the container. We are now this week going to be in this space between where you've built your first container and where you're in a full CNCF landscape of like everything in the world, right? So we're going to talk a little bit about that, but map where automation works within each of the different parts of like a CI/CD pipeline, because we need to understand how the individual components work before we can ever go and build the whole thing, right? I mean, how would we build it? Bottleneck, how's it going? We're just doing the recording a little bit. So a little bit of the Unix 6 review. These are the things that we kind of talked about last week. We talked about triggering a build, and we went and wrote our own little tool inside of, we use the iNotify tools inside of Bash to watch something, and then every time we updated our web page, we rebuilt our container, right? That was one of our tasks for last week. And we can use Packer or Aptainer. We were using Packer with a kickoff from Bash to like rerun itself, right? You can also use Docker files, straight Docker files or Podman files, as you want to call them, to take an image down and modify it to be what we would call bespoke for an environment, right? These are the things that we do in our systems. So last week we talked about this container image workflow, where maybe you pull something down from external, you modify it in some way, you push it up, and we use this term, the artifact. There's an artifact process where we generate a thing that goes on to the next step. Sometimes we control the next step, sometimes we don't. Sometimes that next step goes off to a dev team or somewhere else, or it gets recorded and goes to a security team. Artifacts can be going all kinds of other places in our organization, but as engineers, we have to understand our process. We can test functionality, make sure that it both still works and adheres to whatever, secondary and tertiary type rules and things that we need and that kind of stuff. So this is a container image workflow that I kind of came up with. In your discussions, you were allowed to modify this. You could tell me, hey, I think that this part could have a few more things. I think that part, or in my experience, it looks like this, and that's what our discussions do. They help us to think through and walk through the process of, understanding this. And to make my understanding better, that's great, right? You find some blog that explains it another way, that's great. Okay, so that's container image workflow. And then we talked a little bit about why we want Docker images. There's a whole bunch of reasons, which we don't have to really beat up, but just to build these environments that are ready to do all of these different things. That's what we're pretty much doing inside of Docker images. We don't have to like restand up an environment and then switch over to an old version of Python or a new version of Python, or no. The container can just bring whatever it needs to with it, and we just focus on keeping the platform steady for it. That's like my job, my side of things. So these are some of the reasons that you might do Docker images. And then, Packer, Terraform, Aptainer, there's these different things. I think Terraform kind of fits more into this week, which is the deployment from that image, but I guess it could be part of the Docker image portion, so I left it in there. All right, so using Apptainer, we showed that last week, and we built this out, and we ran through some containers, and then we wrote some HashiCorp Packer language and got that working kind of the way that we expected, and that's all review from last week, right? So for this week, what we're going to do now is talk about, and I'm going to show you a visual here in a second, that's like the space between. We're going to talk about containerized environments versus just straight Kubernetes. Because a lot of you, very astutely, are going to say, okay, Scott, I've got an image now, and you showed me how to deploy it 1Z, 2Z, one-off type stuff, but I don't want to do that. I want to jump all the way over to Kubernetes. I want to jump deep down. This is what all the companies are doing. This is the popular way of doing it. I want to have a fully fleshed out K8s deployment. And I say, okay. But I might argue that there's a large gulf in between there where some people just run container environments, and they never get to this fully matured Kubernetes thing. So there's a little bit of a discussion about that, and we'll get into that here in a minute. And then code snippet for Terraform, we're looking at a problem in Terraform, and we're trying to figure out what's happening. So we're evaluating something and thinking through it. And then we've got a worksheet for this week, and then we've got container environments, which is past the build of containers, and more of like the deployments and making a ready environment that our processes and tooling can interact with. And then it's the same 2 course objectives. All right, so while we're sitting here, I'm going to pull up the discussions for this week. So here's the Unit 7 discussions. And the first one says, you are a team lead of a small Linux team maintaining about 700 servers. That's about mid-range, right? Your management is always pushing for getting more from the systems and has been asking you to explore container environments. So you're like, okay, what is that? And they want especially to know about going up in the cloud. Everybody wants to know about how to wring out this cloud and get more from it, right? So you read some blog posts about services and decide to write out your notes. So here's a whole bunch of blogs about Elastic Container Service versus Elastic Kubernetes Service. And I say, what are the major differences between container environments and Kubernetes orchestrated environments? What are like the strengths and the weaknesses of them? Really, container environments are like a lesser version of that, so that's something you might want to point out. And I say, why might you just want a containerized environment? When might you want a fully orchestrated environment? And can you compare and contrast them? So you're doing that little explanation where you're arguing between the two. But one of the answers that I might say is, let me pull up something for 1 second. I think it's this next slide. Yeah, right here. I want you to think about this for a second. You did your first individual container deploy maybe last week, or maybe your company has, and then now this is a cloud native landscape with every bit of automation that you could possibly have. And do you guys understand that there's a long way in between them? There is a huge gulf between just having a basic environment and maybe starting to stand up some containers over here, and when you're like in this fully mature, I have, a Kubernetes deployment that is fully automated from start to finish, where everything that comes into a pipeline becomes a whatever in its own namespace and does all these things. Like that's a long way, guys. There's a lot of difference in between there. And with that long way comes cost, having to have engineers that maybe have expertise in some of these areas. And I just really want to emphasize that as you're thinking about this as an engineer, because this is probably one of the things that comes up the most when we sit around and talk about this stuff, is people are like, well, this Meta or FANG type organization, or MANG or whatever they're calling themselves now, they do it 100% like this. Why can't we do it like that? Well, we don't. Our company has an IT department of 5 guys, and you're the one Linux engineer. You're not going to have time to build all that. You're not, you know what I'm saying? So you've got to have some place. You're going to land somewhere before a fully deployed implementation of CNCF landscape. I've never been anywhere that has the whole thing deployed. That's not reasonable. So there's overlapping services and stuff, so you wouldn't. But my point in saying that is, you really have to kind of wrap your head around the fact that, like, just because you read it and like at Amazon they do this thing does not mean your organization's going to do that thing. You are going to fall probably somewhere between individual node and container image deployments and Kubernetes. And yeah, maybe you have a Kubernetes instance up, but maybe it's not reliable enough to go prime time on a smaller company, and that's a very possible thing. So anyways, where I'm going with this is, you're going to compare maybe why ECS might be better for you than going for like a full EKS or like a Kubernetes type deployment. That's your first discussion post. Your second discussion post is, your team has been having problems with a deployment. This is the code snippet they're using. Here's the code snippet right here. It actually comes from the lab. And it says, what is happening? Like, what is the provider they're using? So what is that? Provider is the first thing that you do inside of Terraform is get your providers. And the providers are, they do not come when you first download Terraform. You have to go get them for each of your different runs and deployments and such. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and you look at it and go, okay, it's this whatever this cruise worker Docker is. Okay, good. And then how many Docker instances are they trying to run? What are their names and what ports are they going to be running on? So you might be taking this apart a little bit and figuring out what's going on with this environment that you're standing up. It'll make more sense after you do the lab too, if you're not super familiar with Terraform. But then your team is having problems executing this and brought it to you. What might you check or do with Terraform to resolve this issue? Because at the end of the day, you are running a containerized environment here. You're not going all the way over to Kubernetes. You're doing this on a node or on an instance, and you're standing this up. What are some of the problems that we might find from like a Linux admin side of things, right? We pull up a Linux tool like this, and we say, well, what would help us to find out what's going on and what's wrong with the system? One of their things is to make sure those ports aren't already being used. If you're trying to allocate, this may be something too to think about. If you're using a really awesome automation tool that's worked everywhere else, but you drop it in a new environment, it doesn't work for you because you're trying to expose ports, but then the server that you're on already has those ports exposed for something else, it doesn't matter how good this automation tool is, it's going to break. It's not, as we talk about, like bespoke, it's not designed for that environment. It's not specialized to that environment. It has been customized down too far to work in that specific environment that we need, right? So the reason I bring that up is, as you're answering these questions and thinking about what could go wrong, what's the things that we're going to try to fix in the environment? What if it's telling you there's no providers? What do you do? What if it's telling you there's a syntax problem? How would you find the syntax problem? And some of this will make a little more sense after you do the lab as well, but this is for you guys to kind of think about. Okay, so let me get this out of the way. Those are our lab, our discussion questions for this week. Then you got a worksheet. That worksheet's up on the Discord, and it'll be included in the book. And then we're going to do a lab on container environments. So we're going to deploy some of these things within our killer code environment. All right? And then describe the activities of how this works in. So this is very similar to the other week where we said automation mindset. Where do we want to deploy things and make things happen more quickly? And then what are some of the automation works within a CI/CD pipeline? We've built out the original Docker images and modified them, and now we're looking at how to deploy them into a containerized environment. But we're doing that realizing we're not all the way over in a fully automated state. We have just done our first individual container deploy, and now we're like just one step down and starting to do the next part with a tool called Terraform. Okay? There's one other thing I want to show you guys because I think this is kind of funny. What we're going to be doing with Terraform is you got Terraform over here. You're going to feed it in some HashiCorp language configured tooling. And then you're going to do like a Terraform init, and it's going to download all the required providers. That's a thing that'll happen. And then you do a Terraform apply, which builds the required resources. And it was funny. I was showing this to the guys, and they go, Scott, there's one other step in there. There's a plan. You can Terraform plan. That is true. Terraform plan is an excellent tool, and it'll show you what it plans on changing. This is actually a really good idea if you're modifying things inside of Terraform with resources that already exist. But okay, plan, and then I say a plan is just a list of the things that don't happen. That comes from a movie quote, so if you guys want to go find that movie quote, you can. This generates, as it builds all the resources, it generates a terraform.tf state file in JSON in the directory, presumably your working directory that is specific to that project. And now, whenever you run your Terraform inside of there, that's where it's going to go look for the resources that are being controlled by Terraform. You can modify this file directly. Like you can go in there and just change this flat file. It's just a flat file in JSON. But they highly recommend you don't. I highly recommend you don't. Because when you go to do like a Terraform destroy, and you've maybe taken the database out of there because you were, rebuilding it over and over again. You didn't want to touch the database resource, even though you had originally just deployed it. When you go to do your Terraform destroy, anything you've removed out of here is no longer controlled by Terraform. It's like you've put blinders on it, and it no longer has those other things in scope. And you really don't want to be modifying those things manually too often. Let me say, if you know what you're doing, you can. and that's actually one of the warnings they give. But I would tell you, for most of us and in almost all of our use cases, like 99 plus, we don't need to do that. But you can look at the file and you can mess with it. It's all yours, right? It's your lab. Do whatever the heck you want with your lab. But just know that in the production world, our tooling needs to be smooth and move through all of its states without being what we call manually intervened, right? Okay, so this is what we're going to be doing in the lab. Let's hop over to the lab then real quick. I'm going to pull this up. I just wanted to show you guys as we do pull the lab up, we are in Unit 7. So Unit 7 of this is automating Docker environments, so container environments, right? That might be a better term to just say container environments. I use Docker because that's kind of the generic term, but they are containerized environments. So automating containerized environments might have been more accurate. And I wanted to show you guys, this is the nod to CNCF real quick, where they have a tremendous amount. Look at all these things that you're probably not going to be implementing on your first day as you get into this. What's going on here? Landscape. I've never seen this not work right away. And look at all these other things. If you guys need this, I'll link it to you because it is useful to have for anybody that wants it. And look at all these things that you could use inside of your cloud native and containerized. And I mean, there's all these awesome tools, and there's stuff to go spend weeks and months and years on if you wanted to specialize in any one of these. But I just wanted to, kind of give a nod to that and say, we're not there yet. We're starting out. We're touching the individual pieces. But that's where you would go if you said, hey, this containerized stuff really is good. Now I want to do some containerized security. I'm going to go use this tool, Falco. And this is where you would go find these different component pieces for security and compliance and these different kind of things that are out there. So anyways, I just wanted to give a nod to that. We're in Unit 7 here, so container environments is going to be our lab. This lab is linked in the course book. I'll link it here for people who are live with me as I'm recording it. For people that are watching this later, just go grab it out of the course book. And I'm going to make this a little bit bigger. And right here, it says this lab is part of a larger set of instruction that's free, and there's the link to the book if you need it. Your development teams have decided to use containers. You want to familiarize yourself with rapidly deploying environments with these containers. So that's what we're doing. You've decided to look into ensuring that automation supports the different tasks that your team needs to do. So here's Terraform if you need to go play with the tool Terraform, if you want to go learn a little more about it. But as this system comes up, it's installing, so it takes a little bit of time. We're going to do a few things in our environment to make sure that our environment's clean and ready. We're going to make sure that Containerd is running because that's going to be our containerized environment here. We're going to check for Terraform and check its version just in case we need that for security or our own stability in the future reasons. What version of Terraform are we running? We might take notes of all these things. And then we're going to move into a directory for Terraform, and we're going to check to make sure that we have no Docker processes running and no Docker images of containers that have been downloaded. So Docker is not running any containers, and there are no container images that have been downloaded. So we're going to validate that here in a second when this starts up. Make that a little bigger for you guys. There we go. And this is the lab for Unit 7 that we're doing. Really just a check at the beginning to make sure that our environment stands itself up the way that it needs to. There it is. So we check that Containerd is running. I see it. I see that it's listening, so we can communicate with it. Terraform is there, and it's on version 1.14.3. That may be useful to me in the future for stability. I definitely want to keep track of where my different environments have what automation tools. I'm going to make a directory and move down into that directory, and then I'm just going to check there's nothing running in container space on this box, and there's no images that have been downloaded. Last week, we dealt with downloading images and building and pushing them back up to our local repositories, but we're not doing any of that now. We're just going to create a deployment with Terraform, and we're going to run Nginx on one instance, right? One container instance. So we made this directory and moved in there. Okay, so we're already in there. And now we're going to view our vi main.tf. And in here, hit I to go to insert mode. We're going to grab just this little snippet of code right here. Little snippet of code. Boom. And by the way, you can find these online. You can modify them in those Terraform labs from HashiCorp. There's some really good ones, but I have a provider, something that I'm going to need to download from out in the world somewhere, of a version of this Docker provider, right? So Terraform uses the providers to interact with API calls, right? That's what it does. Then we use the provider Docker to say, here is a Docker Docker image for Nginx, and it's going to be tagged as Nginx latest. That's what we're going to go pull out of the world. And then we're going to not keep it locally. And then we're going to, from that Nginx Docker container, we're going to grab the latest, we'll call it tutorial, and we're just going to deploy it on our system on port 8000. That's all we're doing. Simplest little setup. This is the, I guess it's like the function inside of the provider, and then this is the name that we're giving it over here. So that's kind of important because as you start to get more complex, you're going to have more and more resources going different directions. So that's kind of useful. We're going to hit escape : WQ, and then we're going to come down here and we're going to run Terraform format and Terraform validate. And it says right here, we're going to see an error, and it makes sense that we see an error when we do a validate because we have a missing required provider. We asked Terraform to validate that it could do this, but this provider doesn't exist. So we're going to see that error. It says right here. This is because the validate is looking to see if we've done an init to pull the provider. We have not done that init. So it tells us, hey, buddy, you probably need to do a Terraform init in this directory. So they're actually telling us right here to do our Terraform init. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull down this version of the provider that we need. And it says here, it's been pulled down. So now if I do an ls-al, we'll see this Terraform directory that was literally just created right now. It was just created in this last minute. And then down in there, if we were to cd down into that directory, we would see the provider that's been pulled down from the registry.terraform.io. Now, you can do that repository. That's the default one that it's always going to use. So that's called a registry, but that default registry, or you can have your own internal registries. So this could go a different path here. If you had your own internal registries, maybe you write your own code. And then in here, there's that Docker one, right? And then there is the 2.13 that we pulled down. And then there's our version, all right? All right, so now we're back here with our main.tf, and we don't have to go all the way down into that directory now. But now we're going to do so we've done our Terraform init, so we've pulled that down. And then we're going to go ahead, we can do a Terraform plan if we wanted to. Again, I said that a plan's a list of things that doesn't happen. And it says that what it's going to do is add 2 resources. Tells us what it's going to do without thinking about if it's going to do it or not. And we can come up here and see what it's actually going to do. And these things that it's doing right here are actually part of what's going to be written out once it does build these things. It's going to write these things into that Terraform tf.state file, or .tf-state, or whatever that file is, right? So let's go ahead and we see a deprecated attribute, which is fine, right? Something that's not going to be supported going forward, but it's just good to note, and then we'd eventually work it out of our workflow. But if we're in our company, if we're staying on that version through the life cycle of whatever this thing is, that warning is not that big of a deal. Now, if you're somebody who runs bleeding edge and updates everything every morning, that is a big deal, right? So this is one of these things you have to think about in your team's workflow. Now, it's going to build that thing, and it's going to auto-approve, so that means it doesn't ask us. We don't have to hit a -y or whatever, or do a yes interactively. By the way, most of us don't want to interact with this when we actually kick it off in the pipeline, right? Like, I don't want something to run in the middle of the night and then need me to come in and hit yes. That doesn't make any sense. So anyways, it did this thing, and it tells us about the deprecation, and we say, okay, I know about the deprecation. If I ls in this directory, I see that Terraform tf state. I can look at that file if I want. And I said it's a JSON format. There it is. You see that. And I highly recommend, like they do, that you don't modify this directly. But can you? Absolutely, you can modify that file. All you're going to do, though, is for the most part, change what resources Terraform is keeping track of. That's the least expansive thing you can do. The most expansive thing you can do is just give yourself a headache because you break that file, and then now you're not watching anything in the resources, right? So let's go check real quick. Did we pull down a version of Nginx? Yes. Did we modify it anyway? No, we didn't modify it. That was our last lab where we were modifying images. Now we're running it. So here it is running, and it's on port 80, or sorry, port 8000 with the name tutorial. And then we come down here when we run it, and we see that it's running. Now you see it with a basic Nginx web server page, which in the last lab we modified that index.html, and you could do that in this lab if you wanted to as well. You could build that Packer part out, deploy a new one, and then pull that one and do this deployment from there. But that's a little outside the scope. You can go look at the file if you wanted to see it. Okay, so now this last one is your team is very impressed that you were able to deploy one container. I don't know why they'd be impressed by that, but let's say that they're simply and easily impressed. Terraform and Docker, now they want to deploy multiple containers on the system. Now they want you to be able to instantiate that whole dev, test, and QA environment that we've done in other labs, where we have like 8080, 8081, 8082, and we have multiple different, maybe even web pages being seen. And you say, okay, well, here's more information about the Terraform labs, and then let's go ahead and destroy what's there. So we're going to destroy everything that's there. And it says I destroyed the 2 things that you told me to build and keep track of. Terraform now destroys it. Also, the TF state is empty, right? There's nothing in there because we've destroyed all the resources it was keeping track of. And now we're going to edit our main.tf, and we're going to add, I'm just going to say D500D. I'm just going to get rid of everything. And we're going to go grab this new one. So just grab it here if you want to do the lab with me. Boom, boom, paste it. Now it's doing almost the same thing as it did before. It's downloading that provider, but the provider's already set up in this environment, so we don't need to download it again. It's checking to make sure that we have that image. Cool. And then it's deploying 3 different resources. The Nginx with the name 8080. Now the name here and the actual exposed port are unrelated. We just happen to have done the same thing. This is an arbitrary name up here, Nginx. So we're going to have 3 of them. Nginx on port 8080, 8081, and 8082. We could have them pulling a different image for each of them. We can even variabilize this later on when we get more familiar with Terraform. In this lab particularly, we're just touching the basics of it. So we're just going to save that. And then we're going to validate with Terraform format and validate. And it says that the validation's good, but there is that one deprecated attribute. But can I show you guys one cool thing? This one thing that I like to show people if you've never done this, is you might say, so HashiCorp language is this semi-structured language. It looks kind of like YAML, and it looks kind of like JSON, but it's somewhere in between them. But what I want to show you guys is I'm going to delete this. I'm going to just, right, isn't this disgusting? Look at this. Who wants to, would any of you like to modify or deal with this file? Like if I gave you this file and said, hey, that's you got to support that, and it's all just flattened to the left, you'd be like, ugh. But I want to show you something. If I do Terraform, but watch this real quick. I want to show you guys. I'm in Terraform validate. That still reads. That works. But if I cat it, watch this. Main.tf. It's just ugly, right? That's ugly as crap. But if you Terraform format, this is one of my favorite things about it. Terraform format will fix the way that it wants to look. So I'm going to cat it again, and we're going to go up. And it said, no. That's the way we want to edit it. So if anybody ever gives you a working Terraform, this is probably never going to happen, but let's say it did. You download from the internet, and it's all messed up looking when you copy it, but it's still an executable. It still works because that's a semi-structured language that's not like YAML in that it cares. It doesn't actually care about the new line characters and stuff. If you ran Terraform format on it, it would clean it all up for you. So that's a super useful thing. Yeah, I don't need it either, watchmakering, but if it can be there, the Terraform format will always clean it up for you. So Terraform format and validate do the same thing because validate will make sure that they do a separate thing, but validate will make sure that the code is good, even if it looks ugly. Format will make sure the code is good as well, but will also then clean up the formatting for you. So I just want you guys to know that format's one. I didn't learn that when I did my Terraform cert years ago, but then I found it and I was like, oh, that's like nice. Like if I need to clean up somebody else's stuff, I can do that. Like I download it from somewhere, I pull it out of a repository or something. Anyways, let's deploy that resource now, or those sets of resources, and then let's go look at them. So it says I'm doing 4 things, not 2 things like before. Now we have 2 other things to add, and it's going to create that image, And it's going to tell us how long it takes to create. So that's kind of nice if we need to look at it later. And then we're going to look at what we've deployed in our environment. And it says, here you go. Here's the one Nginx that you pulled down. Here's the 8080, 8081, and 8082. Not quite in order, but they're all there. And there you go, hitting port 8080 on your box, 8081, and 8082. If you're really crazy, you can go ss-ntulp, and you can always see exposed ports from the base Linux. So like if you're a Linux admin coming in to troubleshoot, you can always look for, right, 80, and there's our 8080, 8081, and 8082 back to the PID, and I can see the actual PID that's running for each of those processes if I need to attach or if I need to go, whatever I need to do with those things, right, as an admin. So here it is. It says, look at you learning automation. You used Ansible to interact with Kubernetes and deploy and remove resources. So now, if you've done this lab with us, you've played with the container components, and let's get this out of the way, and you were doing a deployment of Docker or really containerized environments. I should probably change that to say this should be automating container builds and then automating container environments. That might be a better way to put those. And then what we did was Terraform here. We were looking at, we're somewhere over here. We're somewhere between our first container deploy maybe last week and then a deployment of everything in all the world. Because we're not, obviously, we're not going to get to here overnight, and we may never get over here in an organization. You don't have to run things just to be cool, right? That's not why we do things in a business, all right? And then that was what we were doing for this week. Okay, so then the last little part of this is if you have questions, let me know down in our Discord. If you just got in here or got in here late, you can pop up into our course discussion posts, and we do have, here's the Unit 7 discussions. So we talked about what the discussions were, but here are the questions and then responses from other people, and you can kind of get engaged, and talk about infrastructure engineering teams and experiencing problems recreating an environment, making things work the way that we expect. And then also over here, this one, look, you can get in here and get involved with what people have said as responses and what they've looked up. And you can talk about, you want to develop a push button solution for maybe deploying Kubernetes or some other set of tools in your environment. And you can look at how to do that. Okay. All right, so I'm going to call this here. I appreciate all you guys coming by. I apologize for down in Discord. I know there's quite a few pings that are going on today as I record each of these. But this was our Unit 7, and I'm going to go ahead and call it. And thanks for coming, guys. Take care.